the God's tactic, the God's tactics, the God's covert tactic, the God's covert tactics, the God's overt tactic, the God's overt tactics, the God's indirect tactic, the God's indirect tactics, the God's direct tactic, the God's direct tactics, the God's soft tactic, the God's soft tactics, the God's firm tactic, the God's firm tactics, the God's hard tactic, the God's hard tactics, the God's beginning tactic, the God's beginning tactics, the God's middling tactic, the God's middling tactics, the God's ending tactic, the God's ending tactics, the God's private tactic, the God's private tactics, the God's public tactic, the God's public tactics, the God's silent tactic, the God's silent tactics, the God's written tactic, the God's written tactics, the God's photo tactic, the God's photo tactics, the God's audio tactic, the God's audio tactics, the God's video tactic, the God's video tactics, the God's past tactic, the God's past tactics, the God's present tactic, the God's present tactics, the God's future tactic, the God's future tactics,